Thank you all for coming. I should preface this by warning you that at random intervals, I may actually punch Daniel. It's not personal. He deserves it.
How these conversations go.
He deserves it.
True.
If you read Salsa Nocturna, the story with the dolls, you know why. If you have not read it, read it, and then come back and let me know how many times you need me to punch him for you.
That is the highest compliment that a writer can receive, of course, wanting to be punched. Wanting to punch.
I mean, I guess. It just makes me feel better, and the internet.
I feel good.
Okay, so we're here to talk technically about Shadowhouse Falls, except we're also going to talk about urban fantasy and fiction in general, because, well, I'm running this conversation and no one can stop me now.
See what y'all did? This is trouble.
You asked for me.
I did.
Technically,
I did this. I can own that, yes.
You walked into this, eyes wide open.
How could I not?
Come on.
Anyway.
All right,
yes.
Listen. So first, before we get into all the details of the book,
let's talk about my boots.
Pause.
Thank you. See?
Never mind his boots. Let's talk about my Chucks.
Wait, they match your leather jacket.
Exactly.
This conversation has already gone off the rails, and I take full credit. All right, go ahead. I'm ready.
I am going to eventually ask why you have on cowboy boots when you're from Boston, except I know it's so you can look taller, so it's
wow. Okay, I've recovered. Go ahead.
So you actually wrote urban fantasy. Like it's actually urban, it's in the inner city.
That's true.
Right. So we've had this conversation.
Let's do it again.
Listen, we haven't had it in public. Okay.
I feel like we have, but go ahead.
Well, we sort of had it on Twitter once.
Right.
And then we upset a bunch of white people. So I feel like we could have it about urban fantasy where you actually get to see the people of color and their community on the page.
Right.
What made you do it?
The fact that it wasn't being done enough. So first of all, I didn't know what urban fantasy was. It's not like I sat down to write urban fantasy. I sat down to write a book that was kind of a love letter and an angry love letter to Harry Potter, right? I loved Harry Potter. I also was really mad that after stepping away from fantasy for like almost a decade probably, because as a kid I loved it but couldn't, like so many of us, find myself in it, I came back and I was like, all right, great, what's fantasy up to these days? Okay, so we're still doing this white savior thing, white dude saves the world, medieval European mythology thing, and there's so much more, right, to the world, to mythology. And I knew that, and I wanted to see it on the page. And I found people who were doing it. I found Nalo, and Nettie and other folks that were telling stories, fantastical stories, with us in it. And that was really inspiring, and it was also really hard to find. And I was like, what's going on? So I sat down to write Shadowshaper very clearly with the idea of saying, like, what if Harry Potter met The Wire? Like, what if it was set in Brooklyn, but with a loving take on what this world is? And what if it wasn't just that we painted a white face brown or black, but we really spoke to the world with our rhythms and with our mythologies and our philosophies and all the different possibilities that might bring up. And that's like what Shadowshaper came from. And then I realized like, oh, there's a genre called urban fantasy that's about like stories that happen in the city, but there's like pigeons and stuff, and so I was like, oh, let me find out about this, so I started reading up on it. I was like, it's all white people, like this is actually absurd, because especially, I think the really galling part about that is that like urban is like what publishing, like white publishing executives who don't want to say black and brown use to say black and brown. But if you put a fantasy on the end, suddenly it's this like all white genre almost, and it was really stark because then what resulted was this very bland version of the city that none of us who live in the city know to be true, right? It would either be this like horrific nightmare zone where, people are just constantly like shooting each other and there's like babies in the street doing drugs and everything else and just like nonsense, or it would be this complete opposite where it's just like happy little, provincial town that also doesn't really speak to the reality of it. And I found that like so disheartening. So I set out to tell the truth, I think, which is what we're supposed to do as writers. And that's where my whole style comes from, is just really saying like, what if we tell the truth about the city for all of its love and disaster, and what if we add magic?
That was really pretty. I got stuck on were pigeons. So we're gonna back up for a second.
I mean,
Were pigeons? Who wrote were pigeons?
it hasn't happened yet. I did
Because
it
I
on
just
Twitter
wanted to know what
once.
the were pigeons were fighting. I know.
No, they're always, of course, they're very sexual, and they're always, there's always, first of all, there's always a Native American wear something, right?
Yes.
And so we have all these categories of different characters that have supernatural equivalents in all this urban fantasy. And then second of all, not to keep going on this, but yes, to keep going on this, half the shit that people call urban fantasy is takes place in the suburbs or in the country, right? Like, what is that? Sookie Stackhouse, bless her heart, is not in the city, but people call that urban fantasy, and it's sort of mind-boggling, just the way words in an art form that's all about language, the way that we completely just disregard what words mean.
I'm just gonna skip my entire Jim Butcher rant because this will totally derail us.
And
Except
we're in Chicago. No, it's fine. No, it's fine.
he
Probably for
can't
the
read a
best.
frick. Lord, my God. Okay, Jim Butcher can't read a map. Just gonna say that. I said that to Jim Butcher. I'm probably on his list of people to never let close enough to punch him. If I'm not, I should be. My neighborhood is in his books often. He gets my entire neighborhood wrong. I live in Hyde Park. He put DePaul in Hyde Park. You know, the locals were like, this?
Everybody's like, what is happening? How dare you?
Oh, we got it. Okay, I'm gonna let it go. I'm gonna let it go. Probably, maybe not.
You know you're not, but go ahead.
You know what? I'm trying to work with you here.
I'm ready. Go ahead.
Don't make me beat you up in front of these nice people. I mean, they might enjoy it. It'd be fun for me. He's not gonna help you, so
Oh, I know. That's all right.
It's not his job to help you. He's on my side. Any rate, okay. So let's talk about your imagery. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the iconography. Did I say that right?
Sure.
I just got back on a flight on Friday, so I have not really had enough sleep to be doing this.
Sleep is for the weak. Go ahead.
Don't get kicked off the stage. Okay, so you use a lot of imagery from a lot of cultures, but you bring us very specifically into some things we don't usually get to see in urban fantasy, right? Except as the exotic other, you make it the central theme, right? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the references to tarot cards, the references, the masks, all of that. How did you choose your iconography?
Well, the main imagery behind Shadowshaper, right, is the idea of murals coming to life, specifically memorial murals. And that specific thing really comes from my time being a paramedic. And I would drive around, Brooklyn and see these murals and see a Brooklyn in the midst of gentrification, which is another topic that urban fantasy that's mainly written by white people completely ignores and pretends doesn't exist, right, for very clear reasons. But I remember one really specifically that it was a mural of a man who had died, and it was his face, and it was on a wall, and obviously someone had bought the house, and they put a fence right in the middle of his face. And it was so heartbreaking as someone who loves my ancestors and believes in their power, and just as someone who loves the city and believes in the power of the city, and to see something like that so disrespected just really affected me. And the power of that imagery kind of became a piece of the mythology of Shadowshaper, because it was also sort of asking the question, what if the murals could fight back? What if they didn't put up with that shit? And then they were like, nah. And then what would that magic be like? And then who would be the person that could wield that magic best? And of course it would be an artist, right? Someone who paints those murals. And then what would her relationship to art be? Which really is to say, how can art save our lives? And I think a lot about that as an artist, but also as a consumer of art and a lover of art. I think we probably all had that moment. For me, it's music a lot, where you're just at the bottom of everything and you don't know where to turn, and you find a song that somehow doesn't lie to you and tell you everything's all right, because it's not. And when art lies to you, and so it becomes almost irrelevant the second that it tells you a lie. But it says there is this one good thing. And this one good thing is that someone else has felt something like what you feel. Like Baldwin's quote, I thought I was all alone with my pain in the world until I opened up a book. That moment, and then you hit the back button and you have to listen to the song again. And sometimes that moment will bring you to another moment or another song, and that's the next thing. But the power of art to save your life is the central metaphor of Shadowshaper. That's what shadowshaping is about. It's just physicalized in the way that fantasy fiction does so well, and to make it so that they're actually kicking bad guys' asses instead of being there for you in a really dim moment. And that was what I was really interested in doing. And then it became just a question of kind of unraveling that. And then what is it, if that's true, if we can take art and meld it with ancestors and then make it something that will actually save us, you know, where do we go from there? There's different kinds of art. That's why we have like Izzy, who's a rapper, who learns how to shape with her rapping. You know, there's a storyteller shaper. There's all these different ways of doing it. And then it just becomes almost like this fun exploration where we get to unravel the world and play with it and throw different scenarios at them. And that's where the tarot deck comes in, which isn't tarot, right? It's called the Deck of Worlds. And it's really about the need to take the natural world as we see it and sometimes turn it into something that put a grid over it, right? Which is so much of the history of a lot of just Western sciences and literature is trying to grid out the world and saying like, okay, here's how we're gonna understand it. We're gonna make these boxes and we're gonna shove everything into these boxes one way or another, whether it's gender, race, you know, different kinds of animals, all these things. And that's what the Deck of Worlds is. It's about taking something that's a natural cultural thing and then trying to turn it into something that's about power under the guise of preventing chaos, but really, and creating order, but really investing in domination.
Okay, we're gonna detour slightly here.
So,
Just a little bit, because when you bring up chaos, one of the things that is central to this series is that the kids aren't just dealing with the problems of the magic.
Right.
They still have parents and school and police and all of the struggles that are part and parcel of being urban youth.
Right.
So when you decided to weave that through, I already know your motivation, so I'm not gonna ask you what your motivation was. I wanna know, how was it received when you decided to bring that into a genre that usually ignores those things?
Right. Well, there's kind of two kinds of readers out there, it seems like. The kind that I cultivate and then racist, you know. But I mean, honestly, like there's a whole sort of genre of pushback on Amazon and Goodreads of people just being like, oh, you know, how dare you do this, and how dare you have these characters, and how dare you try to bring up these things, and they're really upset, and they're really angry, and they can't conceptualize of people of color with humanity, you know, basically. And I find those to be useful in the form of screen grabbing and posting on Twitter with a link of where to buy the book, and then everyone goes, wow, if you pissed off racists that much, this book must be amazing. And then like it's actually a very good marketing technique. But for the most part, I find that people...
That warms the cockles of my heart, sorry.
I mean, it works. No, but what I found overwhelming, the response to Shadowshaper from Jump has just always been people coming to me and saying, wow, I found home in a book for the first time. And that's kind of like that's exactly why I wrote the book. And because that's a feeling that I know, you know, and that I longed for and finally found in different ways, and how that can be such a life-saving moment again. You know, again, art kind of like stepping in. So it was about that, and again, it's also about this idea of telling those truths that we don't see enough. I mean, whenever I'm reading and I feel like something's being ignored, that's what inspires me. That's where I say like, oh wow, there are these, you know, things that we all know to be true that are just blatantly just being disregarded by like a whole genre. That's a place where we get to have an amazing conversation, you know? And I think that's true in activism too. You know, as you know from your own activism, like that's where we step in and be like, no, actually we're gonna have this conversation. Whether it's with a hashtag, whether it's with, you know, an event, a forum, whatever it may be. And then for also you and your work in fiction, that's where you step in and say like, let's talk about this, and let's talk about it in very complex and stark and brutally honest ways that allow for lots of different ways of tossing it up into the air and chewing on it. I mean, that's great literature, right? It's like, let me give you these layers of reality, of oppression, of power, of the different challenges that we have as people of color. That's what great literature is made of. And I think we've been laboring under this idea that literature gets somehow worse or flat when you talk about what people will call politics, but is really just the truth. And that's kind of been the going like advice for writers. It's like, oh, keep politics out of your work. Don't keep politics out of your online presence, right? And politics is really a code of, it's really a way of saying shut up. Like stop telling your truth, stop challenging what we have established as the order of things, and just keep it moving.
So, since we're talking about activism, I know that Black Lives Matter is part of your motivation for what's happening here. Choosing Sierra as the hero, choosing to position and flip the lone white chosen one on its head. You went woman and not man. Why?
Honestly, that was a very natural occurrence. That wasn't a decision to be like, oh, let me really flip the script, right? For those of you guys who are writers, like you're coming up with a story or an idea, and you sort of ask the universe, or your own imagination, like who's going to step up? Who's going to be this in this moment? And that's really what I did as a brand new baby writer back in 2009, and I had no idea how to write a book. I just knew I was mad at Harry Potter and I wanted to do something about it. Lovingly mad. So I sat down and I was like, what if we tell this story in Brooklyn? And what if there's all kinds of cool monsters and magic like I've always wanted to do? And by the way, I made a very excellent beginner mistake in trying to include, in the first draft of Shadowshaper, which is posted on Wattpad, because it's a totally different book. I basically was like, I might never write another book, so let me just take all the monsters that I've been dreaming up my whole life, which is a lot of monsters, because that's what I do. Since I saw Return of the Jedi when I was 3, I've been making up monsters.
The first mistake.
Yes. So, I just like threw them all into the book. So it's just like full of monsters. And one little side note is that there's some characters that know how to make murals come to life. And the murals at the end of the book all rise up and kind of like storm across Brooklyn in this huge monster-like parade. And it's really cool, but it's literally the coolest part of that book. And I got the great advice to take the coolest part of this very overburdened with lots of cool monsters book and just run with that, which is how it became Shadowshaping. But anyway, I asked the universe and I asked my imagination, who's gonna step up? What character is going to be in this book and inhabit this world and this mythology? And there was no debate. It was just Sierra stepped forward and was like, it's me. And I was like, oh, shit. Like, you're different than me in a whole lot of ways. Like, how are we going to do this? And that was before that was a cool conversation to have online. Right. And the going, conversation about that, which was usually that I had seen, by white professors talking about it, was basically like, it's cool. It's cool to write the other. Do your research and everything will be fine. And I knew that was bullshit because I knew nothing is just do your research and you'll be fine. That's like anthropology, which is how a whole lot of people ended up dying, right? And so I knew there was more to it than that, and I'd done a lot of work leading up to that as an activist around privilege and race and different concepts of gender and violence and how they all fit together. That was what I was doing at that time. So it became a question of soul searching. It became a question of asking myself if I could really do it. And also, I didn't have her racially figured out when I first started. I was kind of like, well, she's Latin. Let's see where that goes. She's brown. She's ambiguously brown. And as I was writing and it became clear that this would actually be a book at some point, it also became clear that if I remained ambiguous about it, she would be coded to look a lot like me, because that's how privilege functions in Latin communities, and especially in white communities. Looking at Latin communities, if you say Latin or Latino or Latinx, they try to get it as white as possible, with as curly or straight hair as possible, and all the other kind of trappings of Eurocentric life. And I knew that wasn't going to be okay with me. And I knew that if I was going to get her to be in any way dark-skinned on the cover, I was going to have it clear in text and clear in canon. It couldn't be an argument that I had. I needed to be able to point to things to be like, look, because I know how they do covers, If you don't get a random teacup or dragon on the cover of a book with a character of color, then you get someone who you either can't see their race or they're light or whitewashed, right? And I wasn't going to be about that. So I knew I wanted her to be, if not fully Afro-Latina, just not white and not light. And that then became the challenge of addressing that in the text in a way that was natural and real, and not pretending to buy into that whole we're just one big happy melting pot family of Latinx people that actually hate each other and don't get along bullshit, because that would have been really easy. And especially when there's that added weight of particularly at that time, there were not a lot of Latinx fantasies out there. There's more now, which is really great. But I knew that whatever happened with the book, it would be carrying that particular burden of representation in a way that a lot of other books wouldn't. And that's where Tia Rosa, the like famously racist aunt, comes in. And what's been sort of like simultaneously like horrifying and amazing in terms of feedback is that there's a moment, right, when she tells Sierra, like, don't date anyone darker than the bottom of your foot. And the number of people that have just come to me and been like, that's exactly what I heard growing up, but they're not Latinx, they're from every continent, they're from everywhere in the world. And just the degree of globalness that anti-Blackness carries became so stark just in the reaction to that moment. But it was about saying, like, let's really look at like what's going on in the Latin community. And let's really address it in a real way and not just, again, like paint a face.
All right, so we're not gonna paint a face.
Right.
I'm thinking about this a little bit. We've only got a few more minutes before I have to open the floor to questions. I'm trying to make sure I catch
Really?
them out.
That was fast as hell.
Exactly. Also, you talk a lot.
It's my job.
You talk a
That's
lot.
what I do. Hey.
It's exhausting. It's exhausting.
It's payback.
You know what? Hold on. Can I?
Oh, punch time. That's a body good. All right, go ahead.
Listen, I warmed up by punching him in the gut. It was great. Oh. Energy returned.
Yes.
So, actually, we're going to detour one more time.
Sure.
I like detours. So, in terms of your overarching body of work, let's rank your books. Mm-hmm. Where would you put this series versus some of your other stuff?
You mean like better or worse?
Yes.
Oh, this is an interesting question. Well, I don't know. I think more in terms of individual books than actual. Oh, you're happy you stumped me?
I love stumping you. It's one of my favorite
question,
games.
because then I do like all the I do think Shadowhouse Fall is a much better book than Shadowshaper. I'm proud of Shadowshaper. I'm proud of all my books. I think Shadowshaper was a book wherein I was like, can I write a novel? Let me find out. And I wrote it, and I was shocked and amazed by the reception, and I'm really excited about it. But with Shadowhouse Fall, it was like, all right, I can write a novel. Now let me see how much I can fuck with the world. And that is a much different place to enter into a book into as a process. And so I feel like it just expands on things in a way that gets really exciting and changes up the game and raises the stakes and all this stuff. I really don't know if I have like a favorite in terms of series, though. I will say that I am right now, because I'm working on it, most excited about Dactyl Hill Squad, because I ended up getting obsessed with that. For those of you that don't know, that's a series that takes place in 1863, but there's dinosaurs, obviously. So in the course of writing that first book, I just got obsessed with Civil War history and with different things that people of color were doing to survive at that time and to fight back. And being able to put that on the page, plus with like characters flying around on pterodactyls, is pretty much like the coolest thing ever. So I love writing that the most. But I don't know, they're all really, I know this is corny, but they're all really different to me, and I love them differently. Sorry.
This was literally like he was talking about his unborn children.
I mean, yeah, that's you know that's what it's like.
I'm just saying. Side note, I actually like Dactyl Hill Squad. Don't tell him I said that. It's a secret.
Hey.
But also, don't ever let him talk to you about history, because he sends me things I already know because I have a freaking bachelor's degree in history.
To be
with a
fair, you send me
specific
lots of
focus.
stuff too. It's a conversation.
It is a conversation, but sometimes I open GChat and I'm just like, who gave you caffeine? I'm literally gonna go to Louisiana and just start putting up signs. Do not. You can tell him many things.
Don't feed the beast.
But he can't have sugar or coffee. Neither of these things, especially cut off the coffee.
Never.
I'm gonna tell the little girl coffee or caffeine. Any rate, so we're gonna make this our last. We're at 5:07 already.
Hey.
You've talked a lot.
That's what I do.
You know. Anyway, so we see in the books that Sierra, all of them get to experience a full range of emotions, which is very exciting.
Hey.
Because, okay, this is my bias speaking. Often in urban fantasy, even if you have characters of color, they are acting in service to like the white lead, and they don't have a community, they don't have friends, they don't have an inner life. they don't have any feelings to speak of until they die, or they just vanish shuffling off the page after their plot device purpose is served.
True.
So how is it working in that whole range of emotions, and how did your editors feel when confronted with something that they had probably never, ever seen before? I am really getting him in trouble right now.
No, honestly, my editors have been really cool, and I can't even, I got nothing, I got nothing. They've been really amazing. But one piece of that is that usually there's only one black girl in the goddamn book. So, you know, like whatever happens to her is like representative of all black girls, and that's not true of my work because that's not true of the world.
Right.
You know, I guess it's like, I feel like it's almost like half, I guess you could call it a political statement, but half of it is just like, again, like, let's be honest about shit. And then in line with that, it's you're following what, I feel like there's a piece of character creation that's a lot like acting. I used to do improv, and you have to sort of inhabit that you know, whoever that character is as an actor, whether you're doing improv or whether you're making decisions on stage based on lines that were written for you. And when you're writing a character, and I always tell my students, like, take an acting class because it does transform. First of all, you will learn how to not be a derp when you're like doing public readings, which prose writers are notoriously terrible at, right? And so like, it's nice to be able to have a little bit of experience speaking out in public, even if it's just in a class. Second of all, that concept of like living a character. And I don't mean like doing a whole Daniel Day-Lewis thing where you're like, you know, living in the 18th century or whatever. I'm just saying like, what a character would do in a particular moment. That's what character creation is, right? Like, however you infuse that heart into them is you're making decisions for them on the page. And the best moments are when you get surprised. Because you'll have something come up in a book that you didn't see come. I don't outline, so I'm always surprised. But I'll have a general idea, right? And then a scene just goes totally left. And that sometimes those are the moments that really just let you know, like, you are inhabiting that character in a way that if they can surprise you, the author, you know, you're doing something right. And that's what it is. Like, it's granting characters full humanity, which seems like the most obvious thing in the world, but apparently is like somewhat of a phenomenon when it comes to characters of color, which is like how we got here. And I say how we got here both in terms of where we are at in publishing, as in finally, you know, centuries into it, like actually seeing more full representation, and how we got here in terms of our current political, you know, nonsense and bullshit, and everything else. Like, those are totally interrelated. There's no way we can separate them. And I think, you know, that's a piece of this conversation.
See, I was gonna ask him one more question, but it's hard to really follow that. Like, it's really hard. Oh, wait, hold on.
Oh, okay.
How many jobs have you had? This is just a purely.
Oh, man.
This is just
interesting.
Yeah.
I've been a camp counselor, a sushi roller, a floor cleaner, a paramedic for 10 years, and a community organizer, a theater teacher, and I taught a class called Monster Doodle.
Okay, now that's definitely not something I'm following up.
Oh, and I was a waiter. I was a waiter like 3 different times.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
you see what I'm saying? Oh, don't forget the musician part.
Yes. I barely got paid for that. So.
There's a reason for that, but I'll go upside his head later. Okay, so we are at 5:11. I don't think anyone is secretly going to join us, although there's somebody lurking back in the dark who I hope works here. Otherwise, he's about to be assassinated, and I'm just gonna sit here because I'm just here so I don't get fined. So why don't we start thinking about questions? Make them wild, make them wacky. Make them
like
work
questions.
for it.
Questions
Make them
are
work
good.
for it.
Oh.
Down here in front.
The boots, can you explain what's
First of all, let me just
This is what's going
take
on.
a little victory stroll.
This is what's going on
Don't push me
with
off
the
the
boots.
stage.
This is what's going on with the boots. They make him almost as tall as me.
I'm taller. I'm
In
literally
the
taller than you.
boots.
Everyone
In the
can
boots.
see that I'm taller than
In
you.
the
I don't
boots.
But even without the boots, I'm like an inch taller.
This is a lie. Honey,
You
come
said like
here.
I'm
You
just-
come up on stage
no,
for a
leave
second.
Leave him alone.
Yep.
Leave him alone.
He doesn't
Anyway.
want you to know he's a teacup size human.
I was in Nashville, and they have this store where the name of the store is literally buy 1 pair of cowboy boots, get 2 free. Exactly. And here I am wearing boots. That's the story.
always wear boots now? Because you have 3 pairs.
Basically, no, I'm nice. Actually, what's really interesting is the first time that happened, I got 2 for me, 1 for my girl, and then my dog literally ate my favorite pair, which were these, but I had to replace them. So now these are my new favorite pair, and they're brand new. This is my first time wearing them, so thank you all for being present for that moment. Aye, scuffed up. That's it.
Yep.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for coming. Hi guys, what's up? Good to see you. I know. Hey.
Yeah.
Yes.
You were talking about representation and wanting to see yourself and your community represented in the book.
Yeah.
But and I have found, I used to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And often, principals or people that were managing firms are like, well, why aren't your students making more things about their culture?
Mm-hmm.
The kids, because they were making drawings of monsters or, whatever else they wanted because
Right.
they're not, their identity's not just being an urban kid, right?
Right.
But that's still sort of like the cyclical cycle of like what is culture and what is not considered
Right.
culture. So I'm just curious as to how, something like you, Mickey, how you sort of have navigated that, or even like there are POC like stand up out there, but
Right.
we're not as accessible or haven't been addressed. Or I'm just sort of curious how you both see that sort of thing.
So I'm totally jumping in front of him on this question, only because I just had this conversation this weekend. I have, my fiction tends to also lean historical. I like to bring magic to the past, and also because literally nobody ever writes about what the black people were doing, especially the black women. I try to work in stories, both oral history that I've been told, and things that seem likely, right? We don't have a lot of narratives about black women fighting back, but yet if you look at the historical record, we do have a lot of narratives about black women fighting back. A fond story in my family is about the time we killed those 3 white boys, so we had to change our last names. And I think often what happens in terms of representation is that schools, and I'm not just picking on schools, but I've definitely noticed this because I was in an academic conference this past week, and we'll talk about that, not on the mic. They are not used to the idea that not only are we fully human, but that we don't exist as teaching tools. So I try to write and create as though the white gaze is not my primary audience.
Right.
They can find it alienating if they want to, or they can learn something, whatever. But I know that growing up, when I was very young, I got a chance to meet Gwendolyn Brooks. And I wrote a story instead of a poem because I was a kid and this is what you do. But she told me that it was a good story and she was interested to see it because I wrote about 2 girls fighting crime. Right? They were twin sisters fighting crime and whatever. Gwendolyn Brooks was also very sweet. She was much nicer than me. But I think what was really important in her head that she sort of drilled into mine was that instead of writing a story to appease other people, I wrote the story I wanted to see. And sometimes the best way to fight these things can be to say, but that is their culture. That is their interest. Because if you don't allow for that fullness of interest, you don't get the kid who grows up to write, hoodoo at the Chicago race riots or the damn doll story. I literally have to slap him over that doll story. Sauce Nocturne is a really good book. You should totally read it. And then tell me how many times you want me to punch him. I'll totally relay the punches. But I think that you don't get things like Shadowshaper without allowing space for the exploring of the monsters and the idea that their cultural stories may just be unfamiliar to the people who are peering over your shoulder.
Right.
You don't necessarily see Brer Rabbit or La Llorona or any of these other things outside of our homes unless we're talking about them. Okay, I totally took over your stage for a second.
No, that's fine. She asked you too.
Yeah, that's fine.
And that was good. What she said. No. Yes, but also, no, I think it's that. I think if you look at the history of publishing, the spaces we've been allowed have traditionally only been spaces of tragedy and of historical tragedy in particular, and particularly when whatever group it is being passively oppressed or passively saved. And I think that what you're seeing now with Mickey's work, with a lot of work out there, I know Dr. Hill Squad, this is a major inspiration, is just finding histories of people being aggressive, not just active, but aggressive. And what does that look like? And bringing those histories to light and then making them fun and telling a great story around them. And I think it's like, really exciting, and because it's a space that hasn't fully been carved out yet, because they haven't allowed us to really do that. And I think it is scary for people who have always had power to suddenly see that like there's these other narratives that have nothing to do with them, you know, that are about other people's power. And that's where you see pushback. And again, pushback can look like the obvious pushback that we've seen very recently and that we've always seen. You know, pushback can be trolls. Pushback can also be books with smiling enslaved people being touted as like the greatest book of the year, which it was, you know, which the book I'm referring to was. And pushback can be very passive aggressive too. Pushback can be in the form of editorial notes, which I once got from an agent saying, oh, that kind of racial stuff doesn't happen in 2012 or whatever. You know, that's pushback, right? Which on its face can just be a nice thing to say, but when you consider the elements of power and gatekeeping in an industry, right, said to a brand new writer who doesn't have anything published, that can be a form of shutting down. You know, that's a way that power functions to shut down conversations that are uncomfortable. And so I think it's important to like throw all those out there because, and a big piece of Shadowhouse Fall in particular with the Deck of Worlds is this whole thing of like, art can do a lot of damage. It can really hurt people. As much as I just talked about how it can save us, art has historically also been used to keep us down. And I think it's dangerous to just get into this mindset of like, art is the great savior and it's always against the norm and it's always, no, art is what people have used for a long time to hurt us. And we need to acknowledge that in order to move past it and create art that does the opposite.
Sort of following up on that, the fact that your book was heralded by the New York Times.
Yeah.
Was that something that helped you? I mean, in the sense that it sounds like, because I hear you about the gatekeepers and all of that. How much does that world, is that world changing?
Oh yeah, it's in the middle of a lot of change. And it's a complex world, right? We can't just be like, publishing is bad, right? Like, publishing is messed up. It's complicated. One thing we can say about it for sure is that it's about 80% white. And some of those white people are super self-aware and amazing, and those are the ones I work with. And if they're not, then they're not the ones I work with, you know. And that's a very privileged place to be in that I get to choose. And it hasn't always been like that in my career. And I've had to like stop working with people that could have been really detrimental to me. And we've all gone through different, you know, moments of that. And so the point is sort of that I always feel like, for me, victory is going to look like me being able to mentor a young writer and not have to sit them down and have the conversation about what they're probably going to be up against in publishing. That's victory, right? So there's going to be moments, you know, if you look at the New York Times bestseller list right now, it's full of black women and people of color in general, and that's amazing. And they're books that are about, you know, that experience, and you know, there's lots of different takes on that experience, and that's a form of victory, right? So we've accomplished a lot in a couple of years. There's a long way to go, and again, the pushback is real. So it's about sort of taking in all those different things. Like, yes, you know, there's moments where the New York Times is amazing, and there's moments when it's trash. And how do we move accordingly is a strategic question, and also one about self-preservation, which I think is another tough piece of this.
Well, and I'm gonna totally jump in here and say this. It also depends. I'm having a career that is counter to probably every accepted narrative about how a writer's career is supposed to go.
Right.
And I actually have this tattoo because when the hashtag and everything happened, everyone told me I killed my career. I'd never be able to publish. So you see the books. The black stars are publications that I've had articles in. The red stars are for books I've sold or I'm in the process of selling. And it's going to grow.
Yeah.
But that happens because sometimes you have to be willing to look at a gatekeeper and be like, I'm going to have to run over you. And we're going to hope that the bridge I just set on fire lights my way.
Right.
Right? And a lot of the things that we both do, I think like we've known each other like 8-9 years now. Like 4 or 5 times at least, people have predicted the demise of one of our careers, right?
Oh yeah, all the time.
All the time.
Right.
And we just smile serenely because as much as I'm willing to pummel him, man, when we get together, and there's some other folks in this room who know and who have certainly been big supporters, And that's the other thing about this. The world is changing not because it necessarily wants to, but because they're being pushed to. There's a lot of moments, I think, in publishing where people are a little nervous, a little scared. I was at WizCon and went to brunch and overheard someone talking about how they were going to have to add some diversity to their books because that's all anybody wants to buy. Right, just add diversity and stir. And then as I'm overhearing this conversation and I'm listening to their idea of diversity, I'm like, that book is going to end up in front of a sensitivity reader. And that sensitivity reader is going to write an email that's going to be amazing. And I have definitely, as a sensitivity reader, seen some things. I once sent somebody an email that called their work literary blackface. And I stand by that. The book is not coming out, which is why I'm not naming it. But I think that you also have to keep in mind that a lot of what the changes you're seeing are occurring because people are willing to just, either I'm going to publish or I'm not going to publish, but you're not going to keep doing this.
And yeah, and that's a piece that I think we can never leave out, is that it's the history of activism that got us here, and especially in the young adult community, it was, I mean, everywhere always, particularly in the young adult community, it was women of color writers who are the most like at-risk writers in the, first of all, writers are the most at-risk people in publishing. And writers of color and women writers, especially women of color writers, are, you know, just in danger of having their career just steamrolled constantly. So for them to speak out, I think particularly is an act of bravery that changed the world. And I just feel like that's a history that we can't lose, because the other piece of it is publishing, without that, publishing would still be, you know, the bookshelf would still be so much whiter in the way that it was like 6 years ago, right? And that's just a very real way that the world has changed, and that we don't even get to fully understand. Like, there's no way to quantify the effects of changing the bookshelf and the radical amount that it's changed in the time, you know, that movement has been active, and I love that. I think about, on the one hand, that we also can't quantify all the stories that were never told, that people had dreamt up but were like, this will never get published. Because how many, I'm sure you've had the same experience. So many young writers have come to me and just said, I never thought a book like Shadowshaper could be published. So I never even tried, because I wanted to tell stories like this too. And now I will, but think about all the generations of writers that just didn't bother. Think about all the stories that were never told. Think about like the bookshelf and what it could have looked like if this movement had taken hold and if publishing had made a way, you know, generations ago. That's like devastating. But it's also, at the same time, inspiring to think like all the lives that are changing, like all the kids that are already growing up, not having the experience that we did, and not having to be like look fruitlessly to find themselves in books. Like, that's not happening right now. Which doesn't mean it won't happen in another generation, which is why it's like this really ongoing struggle.
Well, and I think it's also important to realize that some things, now I'm going to talk about Dactyl Hill Squad, a lot of times the books that did come out were books that were history, right? You were slaves, you were whatever. Like, I'm going to skip the entire moratorium of the entire pantheon of books that remind you that your ancestors went through bad things. But sometimes kids just want to be pirates. Yeah. They just want to be, you know, and I was in speculative fiction and what was called Race Fail 09, and you can look it up, and there's a lot of documentation of how mean I was. And I was mean. I'll stand by that. But a lot of the shifting of the genre had to happen because the past was being rewritten, and we learn more from fiction sometimes than fact, right? You have people that will argue you down. The Game of Thrones is as white as it is because there wouldn't have been any brown people in medieval European settings, which, Lord God. First of all, pick up a history book. I can tell you about the Chinese laundries in Limehouse. I can tell you about Queen Elizabeth I's proclamations about the black people walking about. I can tell you Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg. Like, you can find all of these things. You can find Jewish quarters and all of these things. Also, surprise, surprise, all those lovely medieval pictures with the fur and the gold and the braziers and the spices and all of that. Break this to you, but white people don't have spices. Y'all don't grow them. You have to go to other places to get them. Fur, not so much. Gold, not so much. There's some gold in Wales, but like, Mostly you had to go to Africa or Asia for these things. And so when people will argue you down about that, you kind of have to pause and really think about, what is our art teaching, right? I didn't name that book that we're not talking about because screw them and that entire treatise. And people can go find out what you referenced if they want to, but I refuse to give that child any traffic. But when you're presenting the past in this way to children, where you talk about the joys of slavery, what messaging are you really sending? What messaging are you trying to send? Right. You're not necessarily concerned with kids learning accurate history. And in case you're wondering how we get to our current political state, part of my nonfiction work is in writing about the way that white supremacist groups recruit and the narratives that they use. A lot of it hinges on them, the kids they talk to, not knowing this history, not knowing that these people are people, not knowing that these communities have value and worth and are human. So dehumanization is a key step, and we have to fight it literally from the cradle on. Sorry, we totally took up your question time. More questions before they kick us out?
What book, if you guys have one or author, kind of provided you permission to write? Because I know that as a young person of color in humanities, that's hard because there's a lot of pushback because that writers are not impactful or
Yeah.
The Harlem Renaissance gave you permission to write. The Chicago Renaissance gave you permission to write. Phyllis Wheatley gave you permission to write. Please understand and trust and believe. The Tale of Genji gave you permission to write. Your grandmama's oral history gave you permission to write. The stories your granddaddy told to get you to go to sleep gave you permission to write. You don't need anyone else's permission but your own. Sorry, that was a mom moment. It just jumped out at me.
I'm good. What she said. But also, but the thing is, you do. You don't, and that's like, you really don't. But the way that we've been raised and the way that society teaches us is that we do. And so on some sick level, we end up needing it, right? Even though we really don't. And that's the trick, is like when you finally get it, you're like, wait, I didn't need this. And then you're like, shit, but I did, because I didn't realize that until I got it, right? Like, it's a game. And it's scary. And so on the one hand, it's absolutely, one of my biggest inspirations is the way we tell stories, right? Like on the street, listen, paramedics can tell a story. Like, you will find yourself laughing and feeling like you're a terrible person because you know someone had the worst day of their life and you're enjoying it. But that's good storytelling, you know? And so I learned a lot in those 10 years on the ambulance. And that's all stuff, you know, bodegas, like nail salons, like that's all places of story, which is literature, which is the root of literature. Like, it's not just like a side corner pocket of literature. That's where literature comes from, right? As Walter Mosley has pointed out, like the birth of Western, what we call Western literature, was by a dude who was blind and illiterate, right? Like, Homer didn't write shit down, he told it to people. And that's so powerful to remember, because we really get caught up in like MS word instead of like spoken word, right? Like, it matters that it comes from something that we said to each other. And I really try to honor that in my writing because I take inspiration from it. On the other hand, Octavia Butler gave me permission that I didn't know that I needed until I read her and was like, holy shit, like, you can do this. You can not only like tell a story with characters of color, which is on its own, you know, at the time she was writing was a revolutionary act and still is, but do it in a way that it's, on the one hand, so complex about power and privilege and the different forces that flow between us as humans in the society, and also a great story that you need to know what happens next in, right? There was this, until I read her, I was still laboring under this false idea that you could either do one or the other. You could say some deep stuff, but it would probably be kind of boring, or at least like a really drudge of a read that you would feel good about yourself when you were done, but it was hard to get through. Or you could like tell a really exciting story, you know, with monsters, magic, and everything else. I didn't know you could do both, but she showed me that you can, and do it in a deep way. And so for me, she lit the way. And that's why in the Shadowshaper series, they go to Octavia Butler High School. And when I was in 7th grade, the teacher who gave me Octavia Butler, Mrs. Middleton, just came out of nowhere and put the book in my hands for no apparent reason other than that teachers are magic, and was like, go read this book. I mean, I was like 13 and had no idea that I wanted to grow up to be a writer, you know, who changed fantasy as much as I could by bringing in people who I knew to be real, right? But she put that book in my hand, and it was like a time bomb, because at the time I was just like, what is this? And then years and years later, I found her as like a viable alternative to Harry Potter. And I was like, I remember that this is, oh shit. And I went back and read everything she wrote. I mean, that was permission, right? And so I try to always honor that with my work too. And so I think we're always kind of moving through this world as artists, like drawing from, you know, drawing from our grandparents' stories and drawing from the literature that's gotten through the cracks and survived and found its way there, that also draws from that, and like just moving ahead with honoring both of those traditions.
And I'm totally going to go the other way and say that I never felt like I needed permission to write, only because my granny ran numbers. Permission wasn't on high on the list of things. You needed to do what you wanted to do.
Oh, that's great.
But in terms of inspiration, this is going to sound real bad, but y'all gonna deal. I actually really got my permission, I guess, my inspiration from the stories at the beauty shop, right? We would go, me and my grandmother had a routine, we get our hair done, we go home, she'd fry French fries, we eat fries, I go on the back porch and eat watermelon with my grandpa because country is shit. Grew up here, still country is shit. But when you are the little pitcher with the big ears at the beauty shop, and the old ladies are hanging out and talking, and man, the stories your elders tell. And I went to books looking for those kinds of stories and could not find them. And so now I write them. And I think that often when we feel like we need permission to be a storyteller or think we need external inspiration or validation, we're really trying to figure out why our stories aren't present already.
Right.
And so you have a duty to present your stories to the world simply because they're in you, and otherwise we lose them. Okay?
That's it right there.
I'm like a mom. I'm going to mom you to death now. We'll talk later. You just stand right there and wait for me. Yeah, he doesn't have permission to leave. He has permission to stand right there and wait for me. That's what he's got permission to do.
Take your medicine.
Just listen. I just had a conversation. I know. So, but I'm just saying, she could tell you that I've definitely been known. There are a couple of people, oh, you can't slide down. You can sit right back up. You can sit, that slide down ain't gonna save you if you make me come down there and make you sit up straight. You won't like it. How you gonna hide behind JP? JP agrees with me.
You want to take another question?
I just wanted to know what was happening there. I mean, nobody's raised their hand.
Do we have time?
No, we're late.
Oh,
it's 5:35.
No, I'm not taking any more questions. On that note.
I was waiting for her because I knew it was that poor baby. Okay.
Oh, we can take it. Do we have another question? Hey,
Yeah.
all right, go ahead.
So, being a Latino and being male, if I can ask you this personal question,
Please.
how did your family take it when you told them that you were going to be an author?
Oh man, I come from a family of story people through and through. So that was like dream come true. They were really excited. I mean, they were nervous, as all families are when someone says that, right? Like, are you gonna be okay? You know, like. But at the time, I was working. I was a paramedic, so it's not like I was like, I'm leaving everything behind. You know, I kind of did it strategically. And my sister's actually a writer too. Her name is José Older, and she has a series called Infomocracy that's like sci-fi thriller, political stuff. It's really cool. And we were just raised with stories all the time, whether it was just totally surrounded by books and just like the love of telling stories and movies and everything else. So it was very, you know, like approved of for real. And I would say for me, the complicated piece was like in line with what I was saying earlier about the danger of the myth of the happy family of Latinos in terms of race. There's also the question of patriarchy to bring up. And I think while my family is like very explicitly anti-patriarchal, I also know the wider family that exists in a very real way. I mean, my closer nuclear family, right? And I know that even without that, like that's just a reality that we deal with. On the other hand, I know that the image of the machismo, like Latin, you know, dude, alpha male, whatever, is also a real thing that we contend with as a people. and that I was very wary of playing into as a Latino writer, because I experience it. I know how people look at me and understand me based on that, and so that's complex. And I wanted to be able to. I knew I needed to be able to talk about patriarchy on the one hand, and not like write a stereotype on the other hand. And the only answer to that is what we were talking about earlier, which is that you write human characters, whatever they are, and however much that's going to affect the narrative is in terms of their humanity, right? So, and ultimately, if you do it in a thoughtful way and with analysis, instead of just throwing stereotypes at the page, what you can do is make the story better and deeper. And that's what happened with Grandpa Lázaro, right? Who was originally written as a very happy grandfather character, like a very simplistic, abuelo. And Lord knows there's a lot of abuelo books out there in the world, and God bless them, abuelos are awesome sometimes, and abuelos are really fucked up sometimes, And that's the truth that we need to contend with as writers. But when all we have are the cutesy, mariposa abuelos, right? That's not enough, because there's a larger story to be told. So it became a question of complicating who Lázaro was, and including the fact that he didn't think shadow shaping was something that girls and women could be a part of, and how messed up that was. And so that didn't take away from his humanity, it made it more real. And it was my way of addressing something that we really deal with in real life. But that's what I was navigating. And fortunately I come from a family that supports that, that narrative to be honest about that truth, even though it's a hard truth to deal with. Yeah, I know. I know it's a real thing that that we all have to face and what that's going to mean. And I think right now in this moment, that's what we're facing, is the fallout of patriarchy, and on a number of different levels. And I think that this moment is one that hurts in a lot of ways and is really exciting in a lot of other ways, because we're seeing change happen in front of our face, and change is terrifying for a number of different reasons and for a number of different people, both for the powerful and for the less powerful, for the most vulnerable, for obvious reasons, right? But ultimately, I feel like we will walk away from this period of history a more just world. I believe that. I think it's going to be a lot of fire to get there, and it already has been. But I know that, for the pain that we're going through and the tension and the anxiety of this time, it's because stories are being told that were never allowed to be told before, and that there's pushback from that, and that is the actual war of mythology that's happening in front of us in a very real way. But I know that the truth coming out about this world and the change that it brings is where we need to be. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mickey.
Thank you all.